Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm Jason Johnson, president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, joined by my co host, Sean Kennedy. Sean, got a great interview today, especially for anyone interested in policing consent decrees. And the LELDF has done a lot of research, which you've led into policing consent decrees. So we're talking with Bob Scales. Sean, it was a great interview. What do you think?
I think Bob is the one expert out there who not only knows about them firsthand, having been in Seattle when they imposed it there, but also studying them over the years and then helping to fight back and successfully do so. For the first time, a major city rejected the Justice Department's basically blackmail. And Bob walks us through not only the stakes in a consent decree fight, but also how to win and what these matter to police departments across the country is because there are terrible repercussions for the public in policing, and people need to be aware of what's going on behind closed doors in the Department of Justice when these get imposed.
Absolutely. And, I had started to think I know a lot about policing consent decrees, having been involved in a couple of them and having, participated in the research that we put out in LELDF, but I always learn more. So here's Bob Scales.
Well, here we are joined by Bob Scales, and Bob is, to say the least, an expert on something that is very important, but you've maybe never heard of. And that's a police or, in general, law enforcement consent decree promulgated by judges, but also produced by the Justice Department. And Bob is an expert in them and actually is a consultant with his firm, Police Strategies. But prior to that, he worked with local governments for the last few decades, including as a senior leadership in the city of Seattle's office, city attorney office, where he was one of the negotiators and on a team of negotiators who handled Seattle's consent decree. So, Bob, welcome to Holding the Line. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
And Bob, one of the things that we learned about consent decrees, and that was sort of brought on by the Justice Department, the new Trump Justice Department's decision to start rolling them back, is how widespread they are. So, can you give us some sense of what are consent decrees, first of all, and how did we get here? Why were there so many consent decrees out there, and what brought us to this point?
Sure. So it all began with Rodney King in Los Angeles. And so after the Rodney King trials, that happened in 1991, in 1994, I haven't seen the memo, but I've read that there was a DOJ memo that basically said that the officers involved in the Rodney King beating were doing what they were trained to do. And that it wasn't really their fault, it was the fault of, the department's policies and training. So apparently this memo became the law, the pattern of practice law that was passed in 1994. And that law, basically says that the DOJ, if they see that if they have reasonable cause to find that a police department has a pattern of practice of unconstitutional policing, then they can file a civil action against that department, to remedy whatever problems they found. And what's interesting, so since that time, there have been about 77 investigations. Let me see. I'll just pull it up here. So there've been since 1994, there have been 77 investigations and 52 findings by the DOJ. And that have resulted in 23 consent decrees, and there are other things like MOAs and so forth. But basically, the consent decree process has no guidance in the statute. So DOJ has just made the whole thing up as they go along. There's no definition of what a pattern of practice is. And instead of suing departments, what the DOJ does is issue a finding very publicly, national press conference, and then they basically coerce the mayor or the city council or the city manager into signing a consent decree, and then they will take that to the judge, to the federal judge, and say, "Here, judge, why don't you accept this consent decree and monitor and enforce it for more than a decade?" And
Yeah.
so there's never been a finding, even though that's what the law requires.
So, one of the interesting things, if you look deeply at this, and just for context for the listeners, is we issued a paper that sort of dug into not only consent decree origins, and we work closely with you on it, but uh, some of the outcomes. But one of the striking things when we were doing research for this was that there were a number of consent decrees, a few after this 94 law came into effect. And then there were under Clinton, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, so forth. And then you see that it go, moribund effectively under George W. Bush's 2 terms, and then an explosion under Obama. And you felt that firsthand. What happened in 2009 that the Obama DOJ decided to explode the use of this provision in the 94 crime bill?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is we look at 2 things. So we look at the investigations, then we look at the outcome of those investigations. So Clinton administration launched 22 pattern or practice investigations, and they issued findings in 13, so 59%. The Bush administration did 21 investigations, and they issued findings in 10, so 48%. The Obama administration launched about the same number of investigations, 23, but 91% of those he issued findings of a pattern or practice. So only 2 investigations did Obama not find a pattern or practice. So what dramatically changed is not the number of investigations during Obama, but the number of findings. So suddenly they were finding pattern or practice violations everywhere. And the other thing that changed, and this is what happened in Seattle, when Seattle came under a consent decree, we couldn't find any information from any other jurisdiction. Nobody would talk to us. But LAPD did talk to us. And before the Obama administration, consent decrees were not that bad. Uh, because what would happen is that the DOJ would actually come in, provide technical assistance. The monitors were not getting millions of dollars. They would provide technical assistance, and the department would end up getting lots of money to implement all these reforms that they normally didn't get. So, so prior to the Obama administration, they weren't so bad. But then the Obama administration said, "Well, we're really going to crack down on these departments that we have findings for, and we're going to hire these monitors that we have close political ties to, usually some kind of law firm or consulting firm." And then all of a sudden, money came into it, and monitors were $1 million a year. And then the consent decrees never ended. So there wasn't one consent decree that was started under the Obama administration that ended under the Obama administration, and some of them are still going on. And
Yeah.
so it became a money racket, and there was the purpose and intent of the law was completely lost, and it all became about money and power and control.
So when we talk about these, there initially there's complaints or there's some, you know, decision out of DOJ because they see something like the Breonna Taylor incident or whatever. And Rodney King, in the example of Los Angeles Police Department, is something triggers it saying, oh, we should look, there's smoke, maybe there's fire. And they start what you were describing a pattern and practice investigation. What happens next? So they've opened this investigation. What goes on next? Walk us through the point until we get to the consent decree. Not what happens in the consent decree, but what gets us to the starting point.
First of all, nobody knows how there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country. No one knows how the DOJ picks a department for an investigation. And in my opinion, from what I've seen, it's 100% political. And so typically, as you mentioned, it'll be a high profile incident, usually in a deep blue city, right? That already has a large constituency of people who are concerned about the police. So the DOJ will come in riding their white horse and say, "Hey, we're here to fix all the problems." And so they will announce, usually publicly before they tell the jurisdiction, that they're going to conduct a pattern or practice investigation. And so in Seattle, I represented Seattle. I was in the city attorney's office when the DOJ did their investigation in 2011. So we read the announcement in the press, and then the US attorney contacted us and said, "Hey, we've got some attorneys and some consultants that we want you to meet with." And during our first meeting with them, they said, "Okay, we're going to do this investigation, and we want your full cooperation," even though we didn't have to cooperate. And they said, "We will find a pattern of practice, so just be prepared." So they'd already made up their mind. I mean, the DOJ already prepares all their findings before they start their investigation.
It has that feeling of the Stalin line when he says, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime." It's like, "I've picked you. I'm
Yeah,
gonna find out why."
yeah, yeah. I mean, they basically said, "We know there's a problem. and now we're gonna just memorialize it in a report, and then you're gonna have to do a consent decree. I mean, that's what they told us up front. And so the problem is that jurisdictions don't understand that they don't have to comply. This is a civil matter. It's not, they don't have subpoena powers. It's not a criminal issue. They 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 have to, in order to get any documents from the department, they would have to file a lawsuit and then have a discovery request. And so they'd have to follow the rules of evidence and so forth. But all departments, every department has cooperated 100%. And we did as well in Seattle. So we turned over millions of records, and this was back in 2011. So a lot of them were hard copies. I had a whole Kinko's office that was full of confidential records. And the civil rights attorneys are not CJIS certified. So CJIS is the Criminal Justice Information System. So you, in order to get these records, you have to be CJIS certified. DOJ attorneys are not. So we literally violated federal privacy and security laws to give DOJ these records that they had no right to have, unredacted. And they went on ride-alongs. They could interview anybody in the department. And then after 8 months of this secretive investigation, no word back, they summoned us to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the chief and the mayor and the command staff at late one night, and they said, tomorrow morning, we're going to have a press conference, a national press conference with the head of the Civil Rights Division, Tom Perez, and we're going to say that you have a pattern of practice and you have 20% of your use of force are unconstitutional. And the room sort of exploded, and we said, that's not possible. Show us the cases. We don't believe you. And they said, no, we can't show you the cases. We can't tell you who our experts were. We can't show you any of our methodology. You just have to trust us. And so that led to, so after the DOJ issues their findings and they totally destroy the reputation of the department in a national press conference, then you have this negotiation phase where they put political pressure on all the elected officials in the department, and they do it every single city is the same. So they destroy your reputation, put political pressure on you, and then essentially force you to sign this consent decree.
And I want to stop there because not only were you in the room, but my co-host Jason was in the room across the country on the other coast. Jason, tell us a little bit about what happened in the Baltimore Police Department consent decree process.
So I was in Baltimore. I was deputy police commissioner during the negotiations. I wasn't there at the beginning of the investigation, so I was there along probably the latter half or three quarters of the investigation, and then I was in the room as part of the negotiation, and it was probably very similar to what Bob experienced. It was very clear that the DOJ wanted a very we knew there was going to be a consent decree. The city leadership had already publicly admitted that there would be a consent decree. There was no question whatsoever what the outcome was going to be. Of course, it was before the election, the 2016 election, when President Trump was elected. Obama's still president. It's the latter part of the Obama administration. They want a very expansive consent decree. That's what they put on the table. I mean, their first draft of what they were asking for was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, they wanted every form of control of the police department they could possibly get. They wanted to put a massive bureaucracy on top of the police department in the form of a board of commissioners, and just policies that you wouldn't believe. And we started sort of chipping away at that. And then after the election, and they realized there was going to be a change of administration, President Trump would be taking office, and it was pretty clear that the Trump administration wasn't going to pursue any more consent decrees. We actually had an out. So as Bob sort of acknowledged, the city leadership in the cities that they pick, they know are going to go along with it no matter what. And so it was actually a position where we could have very easily opted out. The city leadership could have said, "Nope, we're not talking anymore about consent decrees until the new administration takes office," and that absolutely would have been successful. But they didn't. They would not pursue that strategy. In fact, the opposite. The city leadership demanded that the consent decree be finalized before the change of administration, and put pressure on us to come to an agreement. Essentially, just saying, just pretty much take what they'll give you.
Bob, why would the city leadership want to cede control of the police department?
Well, in Seattle, the mayor at the time did not want to do that. What happened was that the city council, that was very critical of the police, basically told the mayor, if you don't sign the consent decree, then the council president will. And that would have set up a whole constitutional crisis within the city of Seattle. So politically, the DOJ, and that's why they have a lot more leverage, right, in liberal cities to do this kind of thing, because they can rile up all the community groups and so forth and get a lot of elected officials on their side, and the press is just all over it. And so it's 100% political pressure. And so the mayor made a calculation, okay, is this better for me politically to sign this decree than not? But there's no police department, right, that wants a consent decree. There's no police department that would ever ask for a consent decree, because it's just counterproductive on every level.
I would add one more thing. I think Bob's 100% right. It is almost all political pressure. I mean, all of these groups come out. The DOJ has been, during the investigation, the DOJ has been building relationships with these groups and basically instructing them to push on the city leadership to be accepting of it. And that's a big part of it. There's a part of me, though, that thinks it's also that once you enter a consent decree, the mayor can kind of blame everything that happens after that on the consent decree. Like,
Mhm.
if it's a big scandal after that involving the police department. Hey, look, we got the Department of Justice in here. We're getting, like, it kind of takes them off the blame line to some degree. They're kind of shifting the blame, the future blame for the things that will go wrong, and there always will be things that will go wrong in any big city, to the DOJ or to the process. And so it kind of
Just to make it clear, when we discuss this being political, Tom Perez, who was the head of the Civil Rights Division, who launched most of these Obama era consent decrees, not that division, but Tom Perez, when he was the head of that division, went on to be the Secretary of Labor under Obama. And then, as a nonpartisan, good government guy, ran the Democratic National Committee. So, and then ran for governor of Maryland recently and so forth and so on. So Tom Perez is no political animal. He has no political instincts or interests or at all. Don't worry about it. Just a regular old bureaucrat and technocrat. So don't worry about that. There's no politics involved in the Civil Rights Division under Obama. None whatsoever.
Is that the Civil Rights Division is a stepping stone, right, for DOJ attorneys to bigger and better things. So Vanita Gupta took over for Tom Perez, and then under the Biden administration, she became number 3 in the DOJ. And so it's and all these young civil rights attorneys in the DOJ, they all go on to great careers either as consultants or as monitors, or they get professorships. I mean, it is consent decrees are money making for the consultants and career making for the attorneys and DOJ.
And by the way, before Vanita Gupta joined the Civil Rights Division under Tom Perez, and then later, when she was the head of it, briefly under the Bush era and the early Obama era, she was at the ACLU agitating for these same consent decrees. And then
Yep.
she was in charge of the consent decrees. We
Yep.
always use this phrase about like institutional capture, like corporate capture at the EPA when like, some polluter has power there or the FDA or whatever. Literally, the DOJ was captured by the activists. These aren't nonpartisan lawyers. So let's talk about something that's brass tacks. This matters to people in a real sense. What happens when these consent decrees go into effect, Bob? What is the experience of the police force, but also the citizens in terms of crime and costs and all that?
Well, you hit on the 2 main things. So costs go up, crime goes up, right? Those that in every single jurisdiction. And so what we found in Seattle, which is the same in every jurisdiction. So when the DOJ comes in, they start their investigation, then they do a consent decree. What is the DOJ telling officers? We don't want you to use force. We don't want you to get complaints. We don't want you to make arrests. Just be chill and just hang out. Don't be aggressive. Don't be proactive. And so what do officers do? Well, there's a disincentive to be proactive under a consent decree. There's every incentive to be reactive and just keep your head down and hope that you don't get a complaint or have to use force or something. And so in Seattle, we saw, and the DOJ really hated this. I looked at arrests for low-level misdemeanors, so trespass in the park after dark, sit lie, that kind of thing. Arrests for nonviolent misdemeanors after the investigation started went down by more than 90%. So basically, police stopped arresting and contacting people for low level crimes. Now, obviously, violent crimes and everything, police have to respond, and they will won't ignore those. But if you stop enforcing, I mean, these are still crimes, right? If you stop enforcing, low level crimes, I mean, broken windows theory, et cetera. I mean, you are going to have more criminal behavior. I mean, if you just let people do whatever they want to do, as long as they're not killing someone, then crime goes up. The other big thing is costs, and this is what most jurisdictions don't understand, is that the DOJ brings no money to the table. All they do is bring a list of demands. And so 100% of the costs of all consent decrees are borne by local taxpayers. And that includes at least $1 million a year for the monitor. And then DOJ will force you to do things and redo things that you've already done and force you to buy IT systems that you don't need or whatever it is. But you're talking in Seattle over about a 12-year period, over $250 million. Maricopa County, it's now over $300 million. In Chicago, it's off the charts, and so the numbers are staggering, and this is all money that could be used much more effectively and for better purposes by the local jurisdictions, but they're forced to buy these reforms and buy these monitors that the DOJ wants.
There's an analysis that we did about crime in this context, and we did Seattle, New Orleans, Albuquerque, a bunch of other cities, and we showed consistently both property and violent crime in the 3 years following it compared to the 3 years before went up dramatically. And I'm not it's not and these aren't this wouldn't track with normal trends in the sense that these are all different start dates, and also because it's different time, it's not a national trend over anything. It's just really, is there an A/B difference between the 2? And then the Axios newsletter did a similar analysis and found most police agencies in recent federal court-ordered reform agreements saw violent crime rates skyrocket immediately. When Axios is telling you this isn't a good idea, maybe it's not a good idea. So when we know that crime went up, we know that costs ballooned. And one other thing that I think is pertinent here is what happened to the public's satisfaction with the police.
Well, this is one of my big pet peeves, is that DOJ claims with no evidence whatsoever that every consent decree is successful. And I haven't seen a shred of evidence that shows that a police department has improved in any demonstrable way after a consent decree, and all the evidence points to things getting worse. And so Seattle, before the consent decree, Seattle PD was one of DOJ's top agencies. We were always going to DC. We were always praised about our community policing. We had a full de-escalation crisis intervention teams, neighborhood policing. We were doing problem-oriented policing. We were doing everything. And DOJ, NIJ, BJS, they were all praising the city. And then the Civil Rights Division comes in, which is completely separate, right, from all the other DOJ entities, right? Cops office, everything else. And Civil Rights comes in and says, no, actually, Seattle's one of the worst agencies. And we're going to dismantle everything that you have put together for this department, and we're going to rebuild it the way that we want it. And now now Seattle, after Seattle just had the consent decree lifted, but they were under consent decree for almost 13 years. And and when I look at what they're doing now compared to what they were doing before the consent decree, 15 plus years ago, it's so much worse. And Seattle is so much worse in terms of crime, homelessness, drug addiction, you name it. There's no comparison before and after. And yet DOJ is claiming success because they say, oh, well, use of force is down. But they don't look at before and after. They just look at use of force from the start of the consent decree until the end of the consent decree. And the other thing that's interesting is that a lot of consent decrees, including Seattle, have a racial disparity component, right? So we're trying to reduce racial disparities in policing. In every single case after a consent decree, racial disparities increase. And so even though your use of force is down, racial disparities are up after a consent decree. And DOJ doesn't mention that. They only mention that use of force is down.
It almost sounds like you're at least somewhat opposed to policing consent decrees. Is is that fair to say?
Here's the thing. I would be told I'm not opposed to the concept of a consent decree. If you
Good.
actually have a department that actually had a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing where your policies and your training caused officers to behave in an unconstitutional manner, if that actually existed, then yes, a consent decree would be great. But they've never gone into an agency that has an actual pattern or practice.
People conflate being against consent decrees with being against police reform or police improvement. And I think you and I would agree we're not opposed to those things. We like the idea of police departments getting better. And if they're acting in an unconstitutional manner, then they need to correct that. Whether it's outside intervention or
Yeah.
what I usually advocate is the department and the city getting better on their own because there's endless resources for law enforcement agencies, technical assistance from other components of the Department of Justice, many people that you can bring in that can help you fix your policies, fix your training, whatever needs to be done. It can be done internally for like literally pennies on the dollar, as opposed to a consent decree and be done in a year versus in 13, 15 years.
And that brings us to the next question, which is so after Obama blows these up, Seattle, Albuquerque, Cleveland, New Orleans, whatever, we get the lull in the first Trump administration. Then Biden blows it up again. And then what happens at the end of the Biden administration? Because this is significant. And then I want to move on to what the next steps in the state of play are. But what's happening at the end of the Biden administration? What's outstanding that is going on that's so key to understanding these consent decrees?
Yeah, I mean, obviously things ramped up under the Obama administration, and then they were on steroids, during the Biden administration. I mean, the Civil Rights Division was just radicalized completely, and but they didn't know what they were doing. And so what they ended up doing is launching 11 pattern of practice investigations and getting 0 consent decrees out of it. And they took a long time. The Phoenix investigation took more than 3 years. I mean, these are just young, idealistic, civil rights attorneys that had no idea what they're doing. And so what happened is at the end of the Biden administration, suddenly they panicked, right? When the Democrats lost, they panicked and they're just like, "Oh, can we do this consent decree, that consent decree?" And they got Minneapolis and Louisville. They started this new thing where they wouldn't show you your findings, a jurisdiction's findings, unless you signed an agreement in principle to sign a consent decree. So before you see the findings, you're agreeing to sign a consent decree. And so then they would show you the findings. And so they got Louisville and Minneapolis to actually sign these things, and they were going to enter into a consent decree, but then they brought it before the judge to enter it, and both the judges in Minneapolis and Louisville said, "Oh, wait a minute, I got some questions about this." And so the clock ran out on the Biden administration, and then of course the Trump administration withdrew, and so Minneapolis and Louisville don't have consent decrees. But the only consent decree that was entered by the Biden administration was Springfield, Massachusetts, and that was actually an investigation, the only investigation that I'm aware of that happened under the Trump administration. So the first Trump administration, basically, Civil Rights Division went dormant, but there were, I guess, a few attorneys left over that got one investigation through, and then the Biden administration capitalized that and immediately entered into a consent decree when it started. Um, but you have all these, and then the other thing the Biden administration did was that their reports. What was interesting is the pattern practice reports under Obama were signed. They were signed by the U.S. attorney, and they were signed by the head of the Civil Rights Division. And the Biden administration, the reports were unsigned. So these are these documents, and they didn't identify any of their experts. They didn't identify, any of the witnesses or cases or anything else. These are just these fictional stories that they call their pattern of practice findings. Nobody's accountable. No, you can't question them. You can't fact check or anything. And it was crazy as a legal document, right? That they're relying on to not even be signed is but, they were making stuff up. They were making everything up, and they were just too inexperienced to get anything done.
And give us the contrast. What happened? Because we mentioned this earlier that nobody fights, but there's 2 places that have fought, and we can put one of them aside because, as we said, it's a small place and aside, but you were intimately involved in what happened in the other major city that faced an investigation, that's Phoenix. What happened in Phoenix? Why did they stand up to DOJ when no one else does?
Yeah, I found myself, when the Biden administration started, I found myself sort of being very outspoken about consent decrees, because I could see what was happening and nobody else was really talking about it, and partly because consultants and attorneys and so forth, they all want to be monitors and they all want to have good relations with DOJ, so nobody criticizes the DOJ. So I started criticizing, trying to say, look, this is what's really going on behind the scenes. And so when the DOJ went into Phoenix, they did a 3-year investigation of Phoenix. And the thing about Phoenix is that it's not a strong mayor form of government, so it's a council manager. So the DOJ would have to get a majority of the city council to sign off on a consent decree. And early on, they had a majority of the city council, but there were a few council members that were opposed to it. So the union, the police union in Phoenix, heard about me and they said, "Hey, can you come down and talk to our city council members, talk to community groups, talk to the media about what really goes on in consent decree?" So I went down to Phoenix a couple of times, met with almost all the city council members, and had great community meetings. And people had no idea, including city council members, about what was actually happening in their city with DOJ. And so after almost 3 years, the DOJ said, "Okay, well, we'll show you our findings if you sign this agreement in principle to sign the consent decree." And the Phoenix City Council said, "No, we won't do that. Show us the findings." And DOJ didn't want to show them the findings, but eventually they made the findings public. And Phoenix said, "Well, we're not. We'll negotiate. We'll talk about it, but we're not going to just run and sign this consent decree." And so the clock ran out, and they were the first jurisdiction really to ever say no to DOJ, other than small jurisdiction Alamance County, which actually went to trial and won. The other city that basically said no was Memphis. Um, and what Memphis did was interesting because they sort of said, "Well, we're gonna do it ourselves. We're gonna hire a retired federal judge, and we're gonna set up some community groups and oversight, and we're gonna implement our own reforms our own way." And I think that's going relatively well for them. But they also said no to the signing the consent decree.
It's funny that nobody says no and they don't realize that they may win because DOJ never actually takes these people to court, like in the case of Alamance's exception, but most of the time, they're never actually suing because they settle before they get there. I wanna, do give you 2 things. So I found online, somebody, the Seattle Times, I think, FOIA'd, did a public records request a couple of years ago and got a hold of the exit interviews from Seattle Police Department employees, cops. And in those exit interviews, there are a series of quotes about why are you leaving? What was the least effective part of your job? And one of them is number one reason. He's 20 years on the job, so he's vested in his pension. He could stay another 5, institutional knowledge, keep it going. Why are you leaving? DOJ and policy changes. Another retired officer said, "Get rid of DOJ already. Let the chief run the department, not DOJ." On and on and on. In these exit interviews after the consent decree comes into effect, they're just bemoaning this. The cops hate it, and as we saw in our research, and I know you firsthand know, morale is a problem. But I wanna leave you with this and ask you to comment on this quote. This is from an academic, and they found a very striking conclusion. Their preliminary conclusion is that the consent decree is an ineffective tool in order to achieve police accountability due to the lack of measurables and public insight. Agree or disagree?
Oh, totally agree. Consent decrees are all about checking the box, right? So the only reason that DOJ has any jurisdiction over a department is if they actually have a pattern or practice, and they lose that jurisdiction if the pattern or practice is no longer present.
But Bob,
And
let me
so,
stop you. Who wrote that?
who wrote?
Who wrote that quote?
I don't know.
Yeah, you're not gonna like it. It's an abolish the police activist. So
Yeah,
this is full circle here. Where
yeah.
I mean, this is so common
Oh
sense
yeah.
that these aren't working that even the people who hate cops think
Oh,
they don't work.
Well, this is a really good point because in Seattle we had set up a community police commission under the consent decree, and DOJ didn't want it, but we were able to get it in there. And the community police commission were some of the most hardcore anti-police activists in the city. And after about 4 or 5 years, they realized, okay, this is a sham, right? That they don't pay it, they don't care. The DOJ could care less about the community. They do not care about your local communities. They don't care about anything other than getting their pound of flesh out of the department and all the political benefits that come with it. And so the quotes that one of the chairs co-chairs of the community police commission was quoted on NPR as saying it was a fraud, a sham, and she wishes that she could get 8 years of her life back. Uh, and so you have this. I mean, not everybody. I mean, the ACLU as an organization still fully supports consent decrees, but the people that actually have firsthand experience on the ground working under consent decree, um, it's very quickly they understand that this is a total scam, and that the other thing is that if you're into defunding the police, you don't want a consent decree because a consent decree will spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the police on unneeded things, right? Unneeded things. And the other thing about what you were saying earlier about the morale, I mean, Seattle PD before the consent decree, we had an authorized staffing level about 1350. And if it ever fell below 1300, it was a crisis, right? And after the consent decree, you're down to like 8 or 900 officers. And the department cannot hire people. Nobody wants to work under a department that's under a consent decree. It would be crazy. And so what happens is that anyone in the department who is ready to able to retire retires. Anyone who is really good at their job can lateral to another agency. So you're left with the ones that don't have any other options and or aren't very good. And so again, it's just counterproductive. It decimates your consent decrees decimate police departments and public safety.
Well, I think this was a very productive conversation, and I'm so glad that we could have you on.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, Bob. Like, eventually, there will be an administration in office that will prioritize police consent decrees. Do you think what happened at the end of the Biden administration is going to sort of carry over when that happens, and that some cities will actually challenge the DOJ's ability to actually force a consent decree upon them?
Yeah, I mean, people think, oh, well, now it's sort of over under the Trump administration, but the Trump administration has lifted 4 consent decrees, but there are 9 consent decrees still, and the oldest, Virgin Islands, has been there for 22 years. So we still have 9 active consent decrees. There were about 8 pattern of practice findings that the Trump DOJ invalidated. Those can be revived easily. You just dust them off. They're already written, ready to go. So this is the problem is that without some kind of systemic, change within the DOJ that could last or a legislative fix that will deal with some of these abuses under consent decrees, it will go back even under Repub this is the thing, is that even Republicans in general don't want to lose consent decrees because it's a great political tool, right? And so there have been some police union groups that have tried to get legislation that can't find a Republican sponsor to reform the consent decree process. And so it is used by both parties in different ways to control, law enforcement for whatever political agenda there is. But the fact that there's still 9 active consent decrees that haven't been removed yet, and part of that is just because I think the Civil Rights Division, has been decimated either by people leaving or being fired, and they just don't have the manpower to deal with all this. They're currently trying to lift the consent decree in Cleveland. They've done Albuquerque, Seattle, Newark, and New Orleans. Um, uh, and so this is going to come back with a vengeance in whatever next administration there is. And that's why we have this brief window opportunity to actually reform the consent decree process and put in permanent changes to avoid all these abuses that have occurred. And I've been advocating for the Civil Rights Division to do an audit, just do a public audit of the last 30 years of consent decrees and expose, I don't wanna necessarily say it would be like the Epstein files, but it'd be similar, right? If you really saw what was going on behind the scenes with DOJ, how they came up with their how they operate, how they came up with their findings, who they used, et cetera. That we need that kind of transparency to show what's been going on because we only know the outcomes. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes.
This was a very enlightening conversation, and as always, it's good to chat with you. And thank you so much for joining us on Holding the Line. This was one of those things where people don't know what these are until it pops up randomly in the news, but it's a lived experience, as they like to say, for the police officers and the communities there. I mean, it was so striking to see the Democratic mayor of New Orleans screaming from the rooftops under the Biden administration, and everyone is just like, "Why is she so upset?" And it's like, "It's costing us tens of millions of dollars on stuff that ain't working." It was so humorous. It's like, "You did this to yourselves." But we're doing it to ourselves, and as you pointed out, this hasn't gone away, and it will rear its ugly head again. So thanks again, Bob.
Thank you.
Well, that was our interview with Bob Scales, who really laid it out as to what goes on behind closed doors and what this is going to mean for the next administration if the Justice Department changes over and police are back on the crosshairs of people, civil rights lawyers in the Justice Departments and across the country. So what we just heard was so important. And obviously, somebody like Bob is such an important figure in not only studying these things, but fighting them. So thank you for joining Holding the Line, a podcast by LELDF about cops, courts, and crime. Please like us on social media and any of your podcast platforms. Look out for our newsletter on Substack and join us next time.